most of the time, most of the time when I make recordings, I'm trying to get my mind to catch up with my mouth. My mouth is going, and I'm hoping. It's almost like I'm just rubbing on the starter, waiting for the engine to turn over. And most of my recordings, my mind, it might kind of turn over a little or sputter, you know. And I've mentioned before how, you know, I might talk crap for a half hour, but there might be a little nugget in there, you know, a few seconds, a quarter minute, where something is good. And that's when you know, my mouth kicks the engine of my mind, and my mind comes back through my mouth, you know. But I think, like all of us, sometimes we have these torrents of thought, and if only you could, catch them. And a few moments ago, I had a nice little one going. It was running for a minute, and so I'm hoping to catch that here. I was thinking about the whole concept of oscillational resolutionism. And how, like, you know, I think a lot about interference patterns, and I think about, you know, cyclicities and so on. And the way in which counter, you know, basically, if you take the same pattern and create negatives of it, you know, whether that's by color or by forces, you know, electromagnetically. I guess however I'm able to think about it, and then you run them counter to each other and basically create opposites in every way possible. And in my last video I referenced like flicker and frame rate, how those might be in some sense like dimensions of time. And then in other videos I've talked about, you know, exponentesimals, cosmological spheres offset from the center by like a plank in a particular pattern, you know, pushing backward toward their individual centers centered around the shared center, which is, all of those would only be, in this toy model concept, would only be like a plank away from each other. And then we think of like light emanating, or like the universe emanating from the Big Bang, the cosmos, rather, emanating from the Big Bang, and the universe and emanating from the cosmos. And another way, I guess, of thinking about that, because then that makes us think of light and the way light emanates radially. And if we look at light, man-made lights, we look at the sun, though usually not directly. But if we look at lights, we can see lines, we can see fibers. And I remember being taught when I was younger how, the philosophical clergy of the, I don't know what age, I don't know history very well, but like the Middle Ages or whatever. You know, how ridiculous it was that they debate and philosophize on how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Yet, now that I'm older, and I understand it a little more, the breadth and the depth of that concept, I realize, well, no, that's a very succinct way of summing up the problem, summing up what we're looking for. And But another way of thinking about it, because that's thinking about things radiating from a point. And I mentioned it before how the Big Bang, we think of like something exploding into nothingness. Whereas in like the first line of the Zohar, as I heard it stated, I don't know, I've never read it. It was like one line in a documentary I heard years ago, but how God withdrew in all directions. And so then you think about it like a point exploding requires a surface extracting from that point of explosion. One would assume faster, and so much, thus enabling the creation of space-time. But it would have to be harmonic. Like it couldn't do it willy-nilly. Like it would absolutely have to be harmonic. It would have to be connected from the very, very smallest to the very, very largest. And then I think of, well, what if we think oppositely, as far as like one light radiating outward? What if we thought of all shadows radiating inward? Every point of darkness, kind of like a little sun, every point on that exterior sphere that is sucking outward. What if every point on that sphere, that cosmological sphere, in my toy model, was like a little sun radiating inward? And if it were, and essentially, that edge would be infinity. And as it grew, it would create greater infinities. It would be a flat line, like looking down at the ground. Light hits it. Like there's always shadows. There's never not shadows. Theoretically, you could be put in a place where there wasn't shadows, where like you were in a spherical room that was completely illuminated, with light shining in it, and you wouldn't be in a shadow. But of course there'd be a shadow inside. Just open your mouth and there'd be a shadow. There'd be a dark spot. There'd be a place where light, that type of light, didn't touch. And that's just using visual light as a way to visualize the concept of light being the full electromagnetic spectrum. So then, as one point radiates outwards, creating direction, these points would be radiating inwards. They'd be radiating inward toward, if every point on the surface, because nothing could ever touch that inner point, that absolute inner point around which all the exfinitesimal spheres are gathered. Nothing could ever reach that true point of nothing, the God of gods, in this toy model. But they reach inward, essentially toward the center. I mean, I don't know if there's a mathematics that could ever be envisioned that could do that. But they reach toward their individual centers, which would seem like they're reaching toward the center of centers, but they'd be off by the smallest physically possible measure. And that's, of course, and I'm calling it the Planck constant, which I don't even know what it is. It's just what I hear about, theoretically, but of course we don't. I mean, we've been studying this stuff as far as history is concerned for such a short period of time. Like, we don't know if the Planck constant is constant. We don't know if the speed of light is constant. And there are those who suggest that it's not, and they've been credible in the past, so. But anyway, I've thought of like shadows, like every shadow we see in visible light, if not itself doing what I'm describing, at least could symbolize full spectrum of light, the full electromagnetic spectrum, like reaching back toward the center, like granular shadows reaching backward. And they say that, I've heard it said that like most energy in the universe is dark energy. Dark matter, or dark. Most of the stuff in the universe or in the cosmos is dark matter, and then even more is dark energy, and that would jive with the idea of exponentesimals and the large expanding sphere of God's withdrawal in all directions, reaching back toward the center. And I mentioned before also how we're larger than halfway exponentially between the smallest thing we can observe and measure and the largest thing we can observe and measure as far as space goes. I have seen a reference to a fellow who was able to measure time up to like 72 decimal places, which is it's completely incomprehensible. And that seems bigger or smaller depending on your cut than anything. 72 decimal places. That's far smaller than the Planck scale. In reference to time versus space and so on, and then the question is, well, how are time and space coupled? What is the Planck anyway? I'm struggling with these concepts. But yeah, if everything is, if these shadows, if these points at the edge of the sphere are reaching backward, then it would make sense, and they're off-cent at the very, you have an infinity of spheres all reaching toward their own centers. They're just like a perfect vibration back toward their own center. And all of their centers are displaced by something like a Planck constant. And as they all reach backward, you could assume with exactly the same force. If it would all depend on the ways in which this infinite number of infinite spheres, it would matter how they were displaced around that Planck constant. Thus, for one, texturing the surface of the shared or the combined infinite sphere on a Planck scale, but then also somewhere in between, and I guess it's my understanding is that between the smallest and largest thing we can observe, the size of a cell is halfway between the smallest and the largest on the exponential scale, which is a harmonic scale. And so that's a good place to start. In some sense, we, on the other side, on the larger side of that midpoint, we as humans kind of, I guess I don't know I gotta get better, and hopefully this video will remind me later in time to get better about the exact numbers, but if we're so many times larger than the cell, then that which is so many times smaller than the cell is something that we are connected to. It's like the same thing as us. In this toy model, just worth thinking. So in some sense, we're like I don't know what we are, like a compound. So the way in which we envision atoms and compounds and all of that, I'm not saying it's completely wrong. Like, obviously, there's so much efficacy in what's been done, and like my word, the world we live in, I can't even begin to understand. I can't even begin to understand like my own apartment, you know, my toilet bowl. It's like a universe that I don't understand. So one of the ways that I think that I don't think my work's important, but working, I have found things that seem important, and they may be. But one of the things that I stumbled on is that maybe in these images, I'm seeing something a little more like what a cell might look like, or what an atom might look like. I mean, I don't know. I have a lot of work to do. Once again, I'm waiting for my mind to catch up with my mouth because my mind slowed down and my mouth got faster. Trying to recapture a little bit of that thought that I had that instigated me to press the buttons to make this recording. I'm assuming that I'm going to pair with this recording the image that I'm working on. At the moment, I'm doing a color filter animation, and I was watching an Imitation Game movie, which has become one of my favorite movies, even though I don't know anything about computers. I don't know anything about binary. I don't like studying computers at all, and I pretty much never have. But I really like the history of computer scientists for some reason. It's weird. Yeah, shadows reaching backward from the surface. We could visualize it by looking at the ground, looking at the shadows. For instance, light, when we look at light, and then the more you look at it, the more you see these things, and I've only really started to recognize these things within the last couple of years, but the actual lines of light that radiate outward from a light source, and of course a lot of that has to do with the optics and the interaction with the eyeball. So one could say, oh, well, that's just an optical illusion, but the optics of our eyes are different than like the optics of another lens in some way. And I've heard people refer to like photons and biophotons. Biophysics is still really an emergent field, at least popular. Never mind beyond biophysics. But like when we see something like that, like there's something happening, something very physical happening at a very minute scale. But anyway, when we look at light, we see fibers of light. And I guess I'm suggesting maybe when we look at shadows, we could see fibers of night. And it is interesting that light and night share mostly the same letters. I hadn't really thought of that before. It's so obvious. But most of the things I hadn't thought of are obvious. ribbons of night, reaching upward. So it would be like every point of darkness as like there are points of photons, or I've heard the term chronons for essentially like photons of time. And then I guess my idea with that, not my idea, but I think, like kind of like every photon would be paired with a chronon, or every photon and every chronon might be the manifestation of some other geometry of forces. Or what we could identify as events on the surface of the geometry of forces. Maybe these points of darkness, which is a misnomer, because the dark, there's all kinds of electromagnetic spectrum light that is dark to us, that we call dark. So there's a lot of places where there's light that we call darkness. So as these individual points, it's like if all light creates a shadow, and similarly, in a world where there's reciprocity, especially on an antisymmetric order, where the antisymmetries are like every possible antisymmetry altogether, then we could think of these points of darkness all reaching backward, pointing back toward the light. So it's like every shadow, if we were to look anywhere during the day, every shadow would be like the edge of the sphere of existence. So in some sense, like we're standing on the edge of the sphere of existence. And again, this is just a toy. This is the toy model inside my toy model, talking about visible light. But as that reaches back, as every point comes to us, as we look at the sun or as we look at a light source, and it's fibers of light coming out, that there's a reciprocal, exact reciprocal form of quote-unquote darkness reaching back toward that light. And where they meet, where those forces meet, is us, is everything. And I guess that's what I was trying to get to. I think I said it really poorly, but I'm very relieved, because that's what I was trying to get to. It's that force along the surface of little points all pointing backward, with like every point would have one line from the surface coming back. Line of force. Every point would like one line of force pointing back. Like one laser of darkness pointing toward the center. And as we look at that center of light, as it radiates out, it's one point with infinite radiations. Whereas at the surface, it's infinite points, each with one individual radiation. And every point is offset by every other point by at least one Planck distance, maybe up to two. Toy model speaking. They reach backwards. That one point reaches forwards. But we can see the striations in light, almost like when we look in our eyes. Like it's not exactly from the center. It's this offset center. Which is why when we see the striations of light, they don't come all the way back to our sight, and they don't go all the way to the center of the light source. They're always kind of around the edge. Part of that could be that they're describing a sphere and that we're looking at equal radiations from the perfect center. And we're just seeing the surface of the sphere of light in those striations. But as far as this model is concerned, anyway, yeah, that would be the point. Individual points of darkness on an infinite sphere, infinitely large sphere pointing backwards toward the same center that is pointing, that is one center pointing infinite radiations outward of an opposite force. The entire sphere offset, the entire surface of the sphere comprised of infinite spheres textured on a Planck scale at a particular harmonic distribution, which I don't know and I haven't talked about because I don't know. That's what I'm looking for. And where all those forces intermeet, that's us. That's everything. That's the cosmos. That's the universe. That's space, time, the whole bag. And I'm not saying that's right. It's just I think about this stuff a lot. And I heard a good quote one time. Dude in politics, kind of unrelated, not really, but kind of unrelated. Well, no, I guess it wasn't. But anyway, there's some young kid, you know, kind of protesting at some kind of political forum, and basically said, "Hey, you know, what makes us qualified is that we care." And I'm pretty much unqualified in every possible way imaginable, but I care. I care a lot about the wrong things. I do care a lot about some of the right things. I hope this helps. Most of the time,